All right, let's dive into one of European history's biggest and honestly most fascinating paradoxes, the 100 years between Napoleon and World War I. Now, on the surface, this was an incredible time of progress, of new inventions, and what seemed like relative peace. But bubbling just underneath all of that, some really powerful forces were at play, turning the entire continent into a giant powder keg, just waiting for a single spark. So that's the big question for us today, right? How in the world did a century that started with this goal of a peaceful concert of Europe end with millions of men in the trenches of the Great War? The answer, as you'll see, isn't just one thing. It's a massive collision of powerful, world-changing ideas and forces. So to really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into four huge transformations. First, the incredible rise of nationalism. Then, a deep crisis of certainty in how people thought about everything. After that, the mad scramble for empire across the globe. And finally, we'll see how art itself reflected this crazy, fractured new world. Let's get into it.
Okay, first up, nationalism. This is a big one. You have to understand, back in 1815, if you ask someone who they were, they'd say they were loyal to a king or from a certain village. But by 1914, that answer had totally changed. Your identity was tied to the nation. And this idea that people who share a culture and a language should have their own state, well, it became the single most explosive political force of the entire century.
But you know, nationalism didn't just pop up as this aggressive political force. It started out as something more romantic, more cultural. Think about the Grimm brothers, the fairy tale guys? They were traveling around collecting folk tales to try and define a German Volksgeist, this idea of a shared spirit of the people. But that soft cultural idea was hijacked, and fast, by politicians who practiced something called realpolitik. This was a completely ruthless, pragmatic approach to power. For these guys, a nation wasn't built on fairy tales. It was forged by blood and iron.
And this slide, it shows that shift perfectly. The absolute master of this political game was Prussia's Otto von Bismarck. He didn't waste time asking Germans to pretty please unite. Nope. He basically forced them to. He strategically provoked three short, incredibly decisive wars. The first one, against Denmark, was all about showing off Prussia's military muscle. The second one? It was designed to kick their main rival, Austria, out of German business for good. And the third war, a brilliantly calculated conflict against France, was the final masterstroke. It scared the southern German states so much they ran right into Prussia's arms for protection. And boom! In 1871, the German Empire was declared, and the entire balance of power in Europe was shattered. Just like that.
So the key thing you really have to get here is that nationalism was a total double-edged sword. On one side, sure, it created new, unified countries like Germany and Italy. But for the huge, old, multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, it was basically poison. Suddenly you had all these different groups like the Slavs, the Czechs, and the Serbs, all demanding their own nations, and this kind of thinking turned places like the Balkans into the literal powder keg of Europe. Now, while all this political drama is unfolding on the map, something just as explosive is happening in people's minds. For centuries, European thought had been built on these two huge pillars, religious faith and Enlightenment reason. The thinking was that the universe was this predictable, God-given, perfect clockwork machine. But in the late 19th century, that whole foundation just started to crumble.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's like one intellectual bombshell after another. In 1859, Darwin comes along and suggests humans weren't some special creation, but just another animal that came out of a brutal fight for survival. Then, Nietzsche declares that God is dead, which just pulls the rug out from under the whole idea of objective morality. Around 1900, Freud shows up and tells us we're not even rational masters of our own minds, but we're actually driven by this dark, irrational subconscious. And to top it all off, Einstein proves that even bedrock concepts like time and space aren't fixed constants, they're relative.
And Nietzsche's famous quote here just perfectly captures the crisis. You gotta understand, he wasn't celebrating, he was sounding an alarm. He was saying, look, if God is dead, then there's no ultimate objective standard for what's good and what's evil anymore. Truth just becomes a matter of perspective, or what we call relativism. Morality can become whatever the people in power decide it is. So, what's the bottom line here? The old, comforting confidence of the Enlightenment was gone, and in its place was the anxiety of the modern age. The universe didn't feel like a predictable machine anymore. It felt chaotic, uncertain, subjective. And this deep intellectual instability created a world where it felt like the old rules just didn't apply.
So you've got this deep uncertainty at home, right? And what do European nations do?
They turned their competitive energy outward in a huge new wave of imperialism. Fueled by all their new industrial power and that intense nationalist pride we talked about, they started this frantic, mad dash to conquer and control huge chunks of Africa and Asia.
So why the mad dash for colonies? Well, it really boils down to three big things. First, the economy. Their industrial factories were absolutely starving for raw materials, and they desperately needed new markets to sell all their stuff. Second, politics. Colonies were basically a status symbol. The more land you had on the world map, the bigger and more powerful your nation looked. And finally, they came up with a new and pretty twisted cultural ideology to justify the whole thing.
And that ideology was called the civilizing mission, which was famously summed up in Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. It took the totally flawed logic of social Darwinism, taking survival of the fittest and just wrongly applying it to human societies, to frame conquest as some kind of moral duty. The argument was that Europeans were racially superior, so they had an obligation to bring their religion, their commerce, and their way of life to everyone else.
But let's be absolutely clear. All that noble-sounding talk about a civilizing mission, it was a mask, and it hid a horrifically brutal reality. The worst example of this was the Congo Free State. It wasn't even a colony of Belgium, it was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II. And, to get rubber out of the country, his regime used forced labor so savage and so brutal that it led to the deaths of millions of Congolese people. It was nothing short of a genocide, fueled by pure greed.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The reason this matters so much for what's coming in Europe. The scramble for Africa wasn't some faraway colonial sideshow. It directly poured fuel on the fire of rivalries back home. When Britain and France almost went to war over a patch of land in Africa during the Fashoda crisis, it made them even more stubborn and hardened the alliance systems that would eventually drag the entire continent into war.
Okay, for our last piece of this puzzle, let's look at art. Because art, it's like a mirror held up to a society's soul, reflecting all its hopes and anxieties. And the art from this period shows this incredible, clear progression from confidence to total, fragmented subjectivity. It directly mirrors all the other changes we've been talking about.
So the century kicked off with Romanticism. Artists like Caspar David Friedrich basically rejected the cold, hard reason of the Enlightenment. Instead, they wanted to capture raw emotion, the overwhelming, awe-inspiring power of nature, what they called the sublime, and the spirit of the individual hero.
But by the middle of the century, that idealism kind of wore off, and it was replaced by the grit of realism. Artists like Gustave Courbet turned their gaze to the harsh, unfiltered truth of industrial life. They started painting scenes of grinding poverty and backbreaking labor, forcing polite society to look at the ugly realities it really preferred to ignore. And then, by the early 1900s, art takes its most radical turn yet. Think about it, the camera had just been invented, so painting didn't need to just copy reality anymore. So artists like Picasso started to literally shatter reality on the canvas, breaking people and objects into these fragmented geometric shapes of cubism. They weren't trying to paint the world as it is anymore. They were painting how they subjectively felt and experienced it. The whole idea of capturing objective truth in art was basically over.
All right, let's pull all of these threads together. These four massive transformations, the political, the intellectual, the imperial, and the cultural, they didn't just happen side by side in a vacuum. No way. They fed into each other, they amplified each other, and together they created the absolute perfect conditions for a catastrophe.
So, after all that, what was the final formula? What was the recipe that made the Great War not just possible, but, in hindsight, seem almost inevitable?
It was this perfect storm. You had nationalism, which had become aggressive, paranoid, and tied to military strength. You had this fierce imperial competition that turned the whole world into a battleground. You had this deep intellectual instability that had worn away the old moral rules. And all of it was locked into place by this tangled, rigid system of military alliances that basically guaranteed any little spark would ignite a continent-wide inferno.
By 1914, Europe was, without a doubt, the most powerful and technologically advanced civilization on the planet. But it was also spiritually lost, politically paranoid, and chained to these hostile alliances. The start of World War I was not some fluke accident. It was the logical, tragic end result of 100 years of these explosive changes all converging at once. The powder keg was full to bursting. The only question left was, who was going to light the fuse?